certainly we publish a sliver of the pie, but there's a variety of nonprofits and publicly traded companies that do really similar stuff to the Global Disinformation Index. And so, these blacklists are pretty ubiquitous in the industry, and they're pretty widespread in their targeting of, conservatives pretty much overwhelmingly.
Washington Examiner investigative reporter Gabe Kaminsky is the author of several reports uncovering the Global Disinformation Index's attempts to defund outlets. He joins me today to share the latest developments in his investigative series, Disinformation Inc. Thank you so much for joining me, Gabe.
Thanks for having me.
So at this point, the Washington Examiner has released several parts in its Disinformation Inc. series. So can you just give me, to start off, a quick recap of what you've uncovered so far?
Yeah, so, our stories have detailed how several organizations are compiling blacklists of conservative media outlets and feeding those to advertising companies with the intent of shutting down those media outlets. Our stories have focused pretty heavily on a group called the Global Disinformation Index, which is a British organization with two affiliated American nonprofits. And that group, the Washington Examiner, learned that it was one outlet on this blacklist that essentially, advertising companies adhere to and can cost companies, news companies, a lot of money. And so, we kind of unpacked that organization. And then the second part of our series and some follow-up stories have focused on how the U.S. government has provided funding to the Global Disinformation Index, which has, raised concerns among First Amendment lawyers and, also members of Congress.
Can you share a little bit more about who are the different players in that realm and how that's all going down?
Yeah, for sure. So, so it's primarily through the State Department, and there's two entities that we focused on. One's the Global Engagement Center, which is a State Department grant-making body, and they awarded $100,000 to the Global Disinformation Index through something called the U.S. Paris Tech Challenge, which was a State Department grant award for organizations to focus on fighting foreign disinformation efforts. The other source of funding was $565,000 roughly from an entity called the National Endowment for Democracy, which is a nonprofit group funded almost entirely through congressional appropriations. Like, for instance, they got $300 million in 2021 in taxpayer dollars. And shortly after our story, actually, we published this yesterday, the National Endowment for Democracy announced that they are no longer going to be providing funding to the Global Disinformation Index. This followed on Thursday. We learned that they briefed the House Foreign Affairs Committee on that funding, as well as one other committee, and really pushed back on taking any blame for providing funding to GDI. But evidently, they clearly are trying to distance themselves from the organization.
So what was their reasoning? They were just like, oh, we didn't know that they had sent all of the hundreds of $1,000s to this organization?
Yeah, no, they're aware they provided the funding. Their sentiment seems to be that, or they had said before that, they don't view any wrongdoing providing funding to the group, given that it's involved in foreign activity. So the Global Disinformation Index operates in America and overseas, but the NED's mission is to operate overseas and not domestically. And so the fact that they're funding a group that's contributing to censorship of press in America, clearly that posed an issue for them, and they clearly have decided for good reason to not provide funding. And I guess we'll certainly track that to see if they adhere to that.
So I want to get into the Washington Examiner reports, and we have recently learned through their reporting that the National Endowment for Democracy is no longer going to be providing funding to the Global Disinformation Index. So I wanted to get your thoughts on that, but I wanted to start off by reading the National Endowment for Democracy's statement. So the president of communications...
I've intentionally not read it so that I could be surprised by it.
I'm excited by this. All right, so the president of communications provided a statement to the Washington Examiner, and she said, "We recognize the important work GDI has done with NED support in other countries to preserve the integrity of the information space."
I'm already wanting to vomit. Go ahead.
"And counter authoritarian influence. However, given our commitment to avoid the perception that NED is engaged in any work domestically, either directly or indirectly, we will no longer provide financial support to GDI.
Yeah. There are some, more than two things really terribly wrong with that. First of all, GDI does not focus on opposing authoritarian regimes. GDI is one of these very sinister, shadowy figures that's purpose is to silence conservatives around the world. Not authoritarians, but people who believe in individual liberty and national sovereignty. In fact, the head of the Global Disinformation Index, disinformation, is a woman who uses Marxist rhetoric in saying what she does. And what does she say is the goal of GDI? To ensure that only socially redeeming communications are out there. So it's not even censoring what she thinks is bad. It's only allowing what she thinks is socially good. It's the most restrictive approach to speech that I've ever heard of. And of course, her socially redeeming content is hard left stuff. So she spends her time trying to crush common sense, decent, even middle of the road organizations. That's the first problem, that they've improperly characterized what GDI is. Here's the second problem. The National Endowment for Democracy, which is, it's not a private, not-for-profit. It gets almost all of its funding straight from Congress's appropriations. Think of it as an offshoot of the State Department. When an organization discovers that one of its grantees has done wrong, has misused funds, you don't simply announce that you're going to cut off future funding. You say, you have misused your grant dollars that we gave you, give it back. It's called clawing back. This is outrageous.
So what is the proper process? You're saying, so how they are responding by simply saying, oops, sorry, we'll just not give any more money in the future. So is that the proper process?
Right. So I have served both as a general counsel at a federal agency, overseeing grants, administration of grants, and in fact, clawing back money when it was misused, and then also overseeing a federal grant-making agency, overseeing the grant reviewers and that sort of thing. So I know of what I speak. What should have happened? The first thing the National Endowment for Democracy should have done is communicated to GDI, your grant is on hold, pending an investigation. So yes, stop the funds immediately, but not saying the grant is over. Because look, even GDI deserves its day in the court, right? Launch an investigation, because there are lots of interesting questions that need to be asked. For example, there's going to be an individual who received the grant application. Did that individual at the National Endowment for Democracy, and the State Department too has awarded grants. So both the National Endowment for Democracy and the State Department need to be asking this. Did the grant application properly ask what other revenue sources does this applicant receive? Because GDI is actually a UK-based not-for-profit.
Right.
Is it receiving funds from Poland, Russia, China, Pakistan? What other foreign governments are funding GDI? And if it's receiving funds from either governments or Soros-related enterprises or Soros-like organizations, then okay, just a second. While we're giving you this money, US taxpayer dollars, to allegedly combat authoritarianism abroad, they know what GDI really is. Then if GDI is then getting funds from foreign sources, are those foreign sources targeted to the US? Because in the end, money's fungible. If Russia is giving money to GDI, or if France is giving money to GDI to attack the US, and the US is giving money to GDI to attack authoritarianism elsewhere, it's all one pot of money. It's all the same thing.
Right, and that's interesting because according to the Washington Examiner, the National Endowment for Democracy was saying that it was trying to clarify that these grants were not specifically for this blacklist, the exclusion list that GDI was creating. But as you're saying, look, that's not how that works.
I think everybody listening to this already understands this, but let me just show the ridiculousness of it. You get a paycheck from the Media Research Center every 2 weeks. You take that cash and you can buy either bread or butter or gas in the car or anything you want. That money's fungible. Even if you've got your own budget that says, well, I'm going to spend this much money for gas and then this much money for pizza, you decide you want to take a cross-country trip, you can put more gas in the tank if you want. You can spend that money as you wish.
Right. So I guess what you're saying is there are still some unanswered questions just because they've put out this statement. This isn't the end of the road for the NED? What do you think?
The National Endowment for Democracy didn't even do the first thing right. It should have initially said your money's frozen pending an investigation. Because far more important than whatever dollars were still to go out to GDI is what happened. What happened? Where did NED go wrong? Why did the State Department and National Endowment for Democracy give grants to this thing anyway? What communications took place in the process? Who knew what? Who knew how GDI was actually going to use this money? Because what we've discovered is that GDI has targeted, at a minimum, 36 conservative media outlets, including all 3 media outlets here at the Media Research Center.
Right.
CNS News, Newsbusters, and MRC-TV. We already know that. Plus, Washington Examiner and townhall.com and Breitbart, several other of our allies in this space, completely targeted them for elimination. It's worse than mere censorship. Censorship, at least the organization exists. They're trying to make sure that we go bankrupt, that we don't have any money to do our work. Mm-hmm. Yet, National Endowment for Democracy has made sure that none of that investigation goes forward. They just simply cut off the spigot and said, job well done. Well, it's not a job well done. It wasn't even a half-assed effort. It was a bad effort that has short-circuited the process for the American public to find out what really happened. GDI is just one of the many shadowy intermediaries out there. We can't look at GDI as a lone ranger. There are so many of these things out in the world that exist to try to kill us. We've got to address that as a macro perspective. We have to, and then who are they doing the work on behalf of? Well, big tech. They're trying to tell big tech where, to make sure that the conservative groups like us don't get the money. They're in league with all of these other left-wing organizations and outlets. They all have their own ways of attacking us. This is just one of the ways. We can't forget that there are a lot of them, and there are lots of different ways that they come at us.